How did the fiction of Leigh Brackett influence the development of Dungeons and Dragons? This is part of the Appendix N series, where I talk about how those books mentioned by Gary Gygax in Appendix N of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, kind of how they influenced the style and themes and content of early Dungeons and Dragons. And Leigh Brackett was a screenwriter. She wrote The Big Sleep, Rio Bravo, the first draft of The Empire Strikes Back, and she's also a Sword and Planet / space opera writer. And this one is hard because on the one hand, it's harder than some of the previous ones I've done, because on the one hand, Brackett's writing is obviously influential in Dungeons and Dragons, but it's harder than with some Appendix N writers to point to, 5 things Gygax drew from directly. It's quite easy, I think, with The Dying Earth by Jack Vance, or Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, or that other Sword and Planet mainstay, the Barsoom series by Edgar Rice Burroughs. But one general statement to make is how obviously formative and brilliant Brackett was or is in the shift from the early pulp period of Sword and Planet to more developed space opera. And I'd say that's the difference between the way that the Western genre develops in sci-fi terms goes from there's just someone out on a frontier and it's an exciting adventure, now that the frontier in America has closed, to a more considered and more epic scope. And I think the way... and I say that's one thing, her influence on Star Wars goes much deeper than just the draft of Empire Strikes Back. I think the way she really meshes the troubled protagonist desiring redemption with fantastic adventure in a strange, often underground environment is actually very important to the aesthetics of D&D. It's a step beyond Conan and John Carter, and it's there in the implicit concept of characters in first edition. And I say first edition because we've moved beyond the open combination of wargaming and chaos in OD&D, original D&D, and we've got a slightly broader, deeper set of assumptions about what characters do and are. And that is, I think, a shift you can see happen, and I wonder, how far is that because of what Gary was reading from 1973 and 4 to 1978. There's more to Leigh Brackett's influence on D&D than this, but it's worth noting that there is a tonal influence which is hard to pin down exactly, but is there. Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, Conan, Kugel are all archetypal D&D characters. But so are John Eric Stark and Matt Carr's the hero of Sword of Rhiannon, and the proto-Han Solo meta-figure they represent. So next, Leigh Brackett seems like an influence on the magic technology of Gygaxian D&D. This is one of the more obvious ones, I think. There's weird, arcane, confusing artifacts that are sprinkled across Gygax's adventures. I don't even mean something like Expedition to the Barrier Peak where there's a literal spaceship. I mean more things like in the short story Black Amazon of Mars, which I have in this collection, where there are these weird opposed pieces of magitech which have a pseudoscientific explanation to do with a device that heats the body without emitting heat itself, or that cools the body, but they're so eldritch and weird that they are simultaneously presented as basically magical. They're physically science, but they are emotionally magic. Similarly, in Sword of Rhiannon, the time travel device that is central to the beginning of the plot is obviously, it functions by science, it's described in those terms, but it's presented also as a sort of ritual magic. That should make us think actually as much of the magic in Conan as the science of Isaac Asimov a few years later. And in this, or around the same time in fact as this. And in the same way that Gygax draws his spell magic from the pseudoscientific explanation Vance has, where there are kind of semi-sentient aliens or energy life forms that can be impressed into the brain in a particular shape to form a spell, sometimes Gygax's dungeon dressing and equipment comes across like Brackett. There's a deep logic and a system behind them, but they appear to the straight player as strange and puzzling. And that's most obvious, of course, in his great Funhouse dungeon, S1 Tomb of Horrors, where you have just lots of weird things that require poking and prodding and understanding what's going on, but are very dangerous. But it's also there in the Caves of Chaos. It's definitely there in the Temple of Elemental Evil, the magically shielded doors, the node portals, the other puzzles which require some prodding and pulling and have a system to them. And it's sprinkled across his work in other places, and it's certainly influential on later, more explicitly pulp-oriented OSR D&D modules. Third, briefly, Leigh Brackett likes unusual words. Gary Gygax, and by unusual I just mean rarer, for instance. And it's just something you just flick to a page and you see that her vocabulary is, even where it is not actively inventive, is intentionally using a wider range of words. Vaulting, dilated. What else can I just see? Flicking to a random place. Pregnant hush. You can see that there are careful uses of a wide variety of verbs and adjectives, not necessarily super rare, but ones where you do not find the same in Robert E. Howard or Edgar Rice Burroughs or H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft has maybe a wider vocabulary, but there's a degree to which it still fits within a certain range. And Gygax loves unusual words, unusual adjectives, very specific uses of verbs. Brackett is an enchanting writer with broad vocabulary. It's hard not to suspect that Gary is influenced at some level by that, and Gygaxian prose has definitely stuck with D&D long after he left TSR. And finally, there are dungeon-like adventures all over Brackett's Sword and Planet stories. Nothing is explicitly proto-dungeon as Tower of the Elephant. Nothing is obviously adventure inspiration as Missourian the Magician. But there is this thing going on where Brackett's heroes often end up in fantastic half-ruined cities or strange, dangerous, ill-lit caves, or they have to escape an evil through a dungeon-like environment. And it's a bit Procrustean, but when you see how influenced Gygax is by Brackett's writing in other ways, including specifically in how he created environments and the sorts of things he puts in dungeon environments, it's fair to assume that her combination of Howard, Burroughs, Lovecraft and others, and I think those are all influences on her, is an immediate influence upon Gygax's adventure writing. So though perhaps some of that is a bit more step back than some of her other Appendix N chats, I think she's obviously an important influence. And I wonder if there's other references that I've missed or from short stories I haven't read that are also direct influences on early D&D. Tell me what you think in the comments, and I guess what other tones and themes of space opera, Sword and Planet you think are important in D&D. Till next time.